important. And I think, the publishing landscape is changing. And I hope that we do have more narratives from the minority writers coming out. And I do also know that it seems to non-minority writers that it's kind of like a minority dominated landscape in publishing right now. I have heard that expressed, but I mean, as someone who's been looking for a story out of Korea for my whole life, and really never seeing that until the last maybe 2 or 3 years, it's just such a long way to go, actually, from our point of view. So I just did want to bring that up.
No, that's really important, Frances. It's so important to hear this. I was shocked when I read this also in your, I don't know, it was an interview or somewhere, this idea that you had never seen your particular South Korean background represented in literature. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's just shocking, So it's important to say these things. And it's actually wonderful. It's a great segue into discussing your book, which explores aspects of the South Korean experience that might be unfamiliar to American readers. Certainly it was to me, and fascinating and challenging in some ways, and really humanizing. So I thought we'd start by talking a little about the book and then move on to your experience publishing a debut novel with a major publisher. For those who haven't read it, If I Had Your Face is a fascinating exploration of contemporary South Korea, told from the alternating points of view of 4 friends. And correct me if I mispronounce. Okay, jump in, please, Frances. Kyuri, Miho, Ara, and Sujin. Is that how you say that? Yes? Okay. As they make their way in the hyper-competitive world of Seoul, they face daunting obstacles, including socioeconomic inequality, impossible beauty standards, and a culture where women are often mistreated by men. Ultimately, though, it's their friendship that offers hope in this punishing world. Kyuri, Miho, Ara, and Sujin have known each other since childhood, 3 of them from the orphanage in which they were raised. With little socioeconomic advantage, they rely on their resourcefulness and each other to make ends meet, sharing a small apartment in a Seoul office tel, which I learned is a multi-use building with both residential and commercial units. One of the things I loved about the book was the characters. You chose to start the novel from the point of view of Ara, who became mute as a child and worked her way up to become a hairstylist. Why did you decide to open the book from Ara's point of view?
I mean, when I first started writing, I didn't actually think that this would be a novel. I thought of it, I was workshopping at Columbia during the MFA program, and it started as a short story in my mind, and I wanted to write a story. I had just read about the Bechdel Test. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it came out because a writer was speaking about how rare it was at the time to see female characters talking in a book about anything other than men and love. And I had to agree, and that reading about that really moved me at the time. And I wanted to attempt something that passed the Bechdel test, and it was also with Asian characters, which I had not surprisingly attempted before my graduate school years, even though I was writing fiction for so long. As a child and as an adult, I always associated fiction, like English writing, with white characters. So it was a big departure for me to embark on this story. And Ara, I started with her, I just started the story about her because I was interested in a character who's kind of removed from the action, and she's in her own world. Because of her disability, she's kind of cut off from the world and has a fantasy life. And it's also, I wanted to write a story about friendship and desperation as well. So that's kind of how it all started. And then as I kept writing, I imagined that they live in an office tower, and I used to live across from one, or my mom's place is still across from one, and I would constantly see young people kind of going in and out of this building. I would imagine what their lives were like, which was so different from my life living with my mom and kind of experiencing all the kind of the burdens of living with your parents very, every single day. And office towels, the young people living in them are very cut off from their family in the sense that they're only there because they can't live with their families. Their families are living in the provinces usually. So yeah.
Well, that's a great answer. And I love this idea. It's so true. I didn't realize that's how you started, but this idea of women friendships, and you took it I think you made some very courageous choices with these particular characters. And in particular, Curie, who's one of my favorite characters and the most challenging in some ways. She has a really strong voice. She's working in a room salon where I've learned businessmen come to drink and be entertained by women. But because she works in a 10% salon, which claims to hire the most attractive women in the industry, Curie is not required to have sex with her clients. So it's not that, but she is still under enormous pressure to conform to strict standards of beauty and has already undergone an eyelid and double jaw surgery. She quickly finds herself caught in a cycle of debt in order to pay for the cosmetic procedures that allow her to keep her job. But so as she navigates this ruthless world, Curie's voice can be startling. And I wonder, do you have a copy of your book with you? Awesome. Can you just read a little bit on page 13? It begins, it's really tragic, getting old. So this is at the very beginning of the book. And, again, it's a very interesting and neat choice you made. Tell me when you...
Sorry, on page 13?
I think it's on page 13. Although I have the paperback. Is yours the paperback edition? Okay, I think it says on page 13 where it says... Oh, yeah, it's the paragraph that begins, "The older girls have to try so hard." It's the up towards the top.
I think mine is a bit different.
Oh, how strange. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Weird. Okay. Well, let me just, you know what then? Let me just read.
The girls have to try so hard with their hairstyles.
Oh, yeah. Could you just read that passage?
Sure. It's really, the older girls have to try so hard with their hairstyles. It's really tragic getting old. I look at our madam, and she is just the ugliest creature I've ever seen. I think I would kill myself if I looked that ugly. But you know what? I think we must be the only room salon with an ugly madam. It really makes Ajax stand out. And I think it makes us girls look prettier too because she is so horrifying. So she shudders. Yeah, Cutie is a very, very specific character. You kind of tell from her internal dialogue and from what she says to her friends that how much she's been damaged from being in her industry and from conforming to these really extreme standards of beauty in her particular small world and her circle. And I was very interested in her for being so extreme, but so outspoken at the same time. And she is a foil to her roommate Miho, who is more kind of wary of what other people think of her and how she stands in society. And Cutie does not have that and is more unfiltered. So it was great to kind of bounce them off each other in a relationship. And so room salons are these kind of underground luxury entertainment. Kind of the equivalent would be geisha bars in Japan, and they are not really spoken about in polite society, but I was really surprised at how, how many of the wealthy businessmen go to conduct business there, and the glass ceilings that arise because women are not welcome to accompany them. And also, the women who work there really spiral downwards into a cycle of debt and psychological kind of being caged in that idea that they're not worth more than they perceive. So that was just such a heartbreaking thing to research and interview.
Yeah, it was really, and I think you were so courageous in giving Carrie this strong voice. It is harsh, and I think it challenges the reader to face the reality of her circumstances in a way that I just was rooting for her even more. And underneath her fierce exterior, she's also smart, resourceful, and caring. She sends money home to support her mother and reluctantly agrees to introduce Sujin to her plastic surgeon, even as Curie, too smart to see the trap in which she finds herself, not to see the trap, wishes her friend would not follow the same path, but they don't have a lot of choices. I feel like people are going to want to talk about, this time is just flying by, and we want to leave time to talk about your journey to publication. So I think I'm going to jump ahead to, we cannot talk about this book without talking about plastic surgery. Sort of the more sensational aspect of the book, but certainly to me, it was very much about friendship and the struggles of these women primarily. But nevertheless, I read a lot of articles about the book, and the New York Times, for example, talked about, and here I'm quoting, the American feminist objective of being true to yourself as opposed to the South Korean obsession with achieving the feminine ideal, all the way to surgically altering one's appearance. I read the word obsession associated with South Korean plastic surgery a number of times, and it really bothered me. And I wondered what your reaction is to that passage.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I mean, it's certainly one of the topics I get asked about most often, and rightfully so, because it's such a big storyline in the book. But I do find that very uncomfortable. I do feel myself getting very uncomfortable with kind of this judgmental Western view that South Korean women are shallow and vain. And if anything, I wrote this book so that one could understand where these choices are coming from. And if you are not born into wealth and status in a very highly competitive country, then for these particular characters, they are using it kind of as a commodity to make their lives better. And who are we to judge people who simply want to make their lives better? And it's a very loaded topic for me. It's in a way, when I'm in Korea and speaking to Koreans, it's a different thing from approaching the same topic to someone of a different culture, because I just immediately get more defensive and try to establish more context about the whole subject. But yeah, it's just more so to kind of trace that back, I also think it's a matter of accessibility, which is a big thing. Healthcare in general, not that plastic surgery falls under healthcare, but any kind of medical clinic is extremely accessible in a way that you can just walk into like 100 different clinics at any moment and get an immediate look. And I do think that also contributes to how much people are making visits to different clinics. Sorry, I'm getting a bit distracted.
No, it's fascinating, and it's really interesting. And actually, I looked up some statistics, And while South Korea does perform more plastic surgeries in the US, approximately 20 per 1,000 people compared to 13 in the US, the statistics also depend, apparently, on how procedures are reported. So an eyelid surgery, for example, which is one of the most common in South Korea, could require several procedures during one surgery, while liposuction or breast augmentation, two of the most frequent surgeries in the US, require fewer different procedures. And the reason I raise this is because I just think the idea that America is not obsessed with standards of beauty, or that plastic surgery and cosmetic procedures aren't rampant. I just didn't seem fair to me to kind of compare them that way. And actually, one of the things you mentioned in your book club guide, which I recommend to everyone, it's a wonderful conversation, is that South Korea is a more homogeneous society than the US, with less diversity of racial backgrounds, and that the pressure to look a certain way can be higher because women are up against a more widely accepted standard of beauty rather than several diverse ideals. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. It's also, I think this push to broaden the norms of beauty is also quite recent in the West. And I wondered if you have any additional thoughts before we go on to, unfortunately, I have so many more questions, but we have to get on to the question of publication. But having lived in both South Korea and the US.
Yeah, there are certainly very kind of much talked about standards of beauty in Korea that are not Western beauty standards. For example, there's this fixation with a small face, very clear skin, and kind of these big eyes, and it kind of, the list kind of goes on and on. But again, I think it does trace back to being a racially homogenous society for most of its 5,000 year existence. And so that's been kind of carried down for a long time. And what's interesting in recent years is that because it's such a shrinking population, it has the lowest birth rate in the world because of all these, so many different societal issues. So first of all, like high unemployment rates leading to people not able to save up enough to buy an apartment or have children. And because of that, Korea is making up its labor force through immigration from other countries. And if you go to the provinces in particular, you'll find that most of the elementary schools are actually minority children, which is for the first, this has never happened before in Korean history. And we have a minority senator for the first time. And so it's going to affect, I think, the way that beauty is talked about. And hopefully there will be more, more accepted ideals of beauty. And I think that that is very true today. But again, it's something that I do feel sometimes very self-conscious and kind of defensive when talking to a Western audience, because there's this like top-down judgy kind of view that I get so uncomfortable.
Well, it is so ironic that America's touting itself is so open and accepting of you be you, and then there's this judgment. Anyway, it's I can certainly understand that. I felt offended reading it, so I just really can only imagine what it was like for you. Although again, I think the intent, we're all trying to grapple with these questions, and it's we're all being tested in different ways, and that's actually why it's so important that this book exists, and it's wonderful that you're here to share your views on it, and thank you. So I could talk about the book forever, but I know that there are people in our audience that really wanted to hear about your journey to publication. So we're going to talk about that. And I can't, unfortunately, really look at the chat at the same time. And I think there's been some chatter on the chat, but we will leave time for some questions at the end. So for those of you who are wondering about that, yes, we will. So first, let's talk about was there anything that surprised you in terms of getting an agent, working with your agent, or once the book was acquired by Penguin Random House? Basically, open-ended question. Anything that that you found surprising or interesting about the process?
Yeah, I was very obsessed for a long time during the writing of this book. You kind of obsess about the publication process simultaneously, and sometimes you're just reading about agents in a way that is actually, when in retrospect, is very not helpful, because it just takes away from your writing time, and you are worrying about something that's out of your control anyway. But for me, from the first words on the page to publication, it was 10 years. And that's a very long time. And a large part of it was because I took time off from my MFA to go work when I had a family situation back home that I had to take leave of absence from school. And then when my father passed away, I took a job in very close to home, so I could take care of my mother. And so taking a full-time job that first time obviously delayed the process. But I think in terms of getting an agent.
Well, Frances, can I just interrupt you on that? Just because we also had a question. We can sneak this in from from our audience. I'm struck by when you said it was a very long time to write the novel, but I don't think it's that uncommon. And as writers, we really have nothing to write about if we haven't lived. So obviously these detours in your journey ended up being incredibly valuable for the story. One of our audience members particularly wanted to know about the character of Ara and how much research you did in order to capture the viewpoint of someone who can't speak. So how much research? I guess there's quite a bit of research involved in this book.
Yeah. Ada, so she is mute, and that also came about when I resumed studying. She didn't start out mute. I made her mute later. That's something I've actually never talked about before, but it was because I spent a lot of time at this job, and it was a very silent job because it was a Korean conglomerate, and I would kind of sit in silence for, I think it was like 10 hours a day, every single day for, years, and kind of withdrawing into myself because of that. And my grandmother was deaf. I grew up with her, and I would go see her every week. And she had other disabled friends, including someone who was mute, and I would see her there. There's it's called a 노인정, where people kind of get together and play this game called Go. So just interacting with different disabled people, while myself being in a very isolated, silent environment, kind of made me want to research more about being mute. And I did go down this very, very deep rabbit hole of researching and trying to interview my grandmother's friends and things like that. But a lot of, going back to the publication as well, it was, I tried to get an agent, kind of cold email agents, and I was keeping a running log of how many agents I was not hearing back from. And that was depressing. And then the way that it often happens, I heard back from 3 agents the same week, which was really strange. And I was offered representation that same time. But I think also I was very careful not to go out too early. But what happened was I felt like it delayed my process by several years, thinking that I wasn't ready yet. And the real catalyst for starting to submit was when I talked to a friend who was a lawyer in publishing, and she was saying that, no, you don't necessarily have to think that your fiction submission is absolutely complete and ready. You should just go out because you'll never think it's complete. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's really true, because I was several years away, I thought, before I submitted. But it was interesting because the two of the three agents were Korean that I received offers of representation from, and they were so like shocked at the story, and so delighted that it was set in Korea, because I think they hadn't read anything like this particularly. And then the other non-Korean agent was also very, said nice things, but I felt like because the Korean agents, both of them, really connected with it on a level that I so appreciated, because I was always very nervous about the subject matter anyway, because of how rare it is. I was like, oh, well, maybe it means that editors wouldn't want it. So I wanted to go with someone who would really advocate for it in a very personal, like personalized mission kind of way. And it ended up just, my agent, Teresa, has been just so incredible. So she acted as my first editor, essentially, and gave me a lot of editorial suggestions. We changed the title. She thought it would be better to add 2 more chapters. And so I worked with her on that for several months. And then
and Frances, did that happen after you had signed with her, or was that sort of okay? So that's nice. So she wasn't kind of saying, Alex represents you if you make these changes. She'd already committed, so that gave you the confidence to know that she was kind of behind you. Well, I'm so curious what your original title was. Are we allowed to ask?
I'm kind of saving it for my next.
That's fine. Oh, for your next book. Okay. Well, this is a great title. So, all right, that's exciting. But that's nice so that sounds like when you said that she's been wonderful, what to you would make a wonderful agent? Obviously, she loved the book. She was willing to put time into reading it and carefully editing it, right? And were there any other particular specific things that you find that are about her?
So what I really appreciated about her for this particular work was kind of walking the tightrope of balance between since it's all, the characters are Korean, the setting is Korea, and they're speaking Korean language, but it's written in English. It was a lot of, the questions I had was, how much of the Korean should I keep in there? How much explanation can I get? Like, how much explanation can I get away with not putting in there? Because I wanted to be as, I didn't want someone like me to read it and be kind of turned off because it was all explanation. I wanted it to be just as much like for someone like me. And so in the beginning, I actually had a lot more Korean words, and I would sometimes cut out a lot. So she really helped me with that, and she understood my concern on both sides. So that was so incredible to have her. And the other thing that I really appreciate is that she actually does not have very many clients. She has, at the time, she told me she had 10 total, and that was, so cool that she could spend so much time and brain space with each client. And I think, she has very high profile clients, and I just couldn't believe it when she took me on, because, I had no name. And that was such a moving experience for me.
Yeah, that's really what a nice, we need to hear these happy stories of the journey, the publication journey, and of course the book is a special book.
That I did have interactions with other agents who didn't offer representation, but they did say, oh, maybe you should change everything to one point of view, third person, like rewrite the whole thing in the third person. And that would have been such a crazy, difficult thing to do. And I was wondering, it wasn't an offer of representation and then revising. She was like, oh, maybe if you do this, I'll take another look. And I was like, oh my God, do I do this? Do I not? So that was kind of a torturous time and then I ultimately decided not to, because I felt like it was such a subjective thing. And maybe, if I didn't hear back from other agents after even, some time, then I would try to go back and revise the way she advised, because she was a very big agent as well.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, because it just goes to show, we all know it's very subjective, but if things had not gone the way that they did, this book may not be the book it is, I mean, but as a writer, I think having written one book and having brought it through this journey of publication, you now you can do this. You can probably write your way out of a paper bag. I mean, that's what I always say. I can kind of write anything now. So, and each book probably could be, each of these characters could have their own story. So there's so many variations on what a book can be. But it's nice to get it done and out, and then it's kind of finalized, because otherwise we could kind of tweak things forever. But you had mentioned to me when we were speaking before the interview that, and actually, I'm sorry, let me interrupt myself. If anyone has questions from our audience, and I know some of you are upset that you can't see all the faces, we thought this would be the best way to conduct the interview, but please put your questions in chat. I have my chat bar up on the side, so any questions that come in, we'll direct them immediately to Frances. And they can be about the book or about the publication process. So Frances, you had mentioned that you said that your agent wanted you to add 2 chapters at the end, I think you said, and then when it was accepted by Penguin, did they also ask for additional revisions? I think you'd mentioned. That's a lot. That's interesting. What did they want?
Very unexpected kind of my collaboration with my editor, because I had expected pushback about not italicizing the Korean words, because I'd always seen, foreign, if it's in a different language, they're usually italicized. And I had expected more pushback about more contextualization and things like that, but none of that came. She was totally happy with keeping that as it is, which was kind of shocking. But she did suggest there was a 5th narrator, and the suggestion was to take her out because there were too many. And I completely agreed with that. That was one of the things that I had felt very unsure about to begin with. And so I ended up cutting one character out entirely. And that was the character I had spent the most time on, and years actually on her alone. But that's kind of turning into my 2nd novel. So yeah, it's been, and I had the most trouble with having her story kind of arc, because I'm always about backstory. I could do backstory forever, and I really hate kind of pushing the story forward into an arc. And with that particular character, I had only backstory, so it just made sense to excise her.
That's actually an amazing story, because that's a pretty big change. And it's interesting, going back to what you'd said earlier about, yes, you want to wait until your book is absolutely ready before you go out on the start querying agents, but at some point you have to make that leap. And you had an agent who accepted the book and loved the book and made some changes, and then the editor went and did something, asked for yet more kind of significant changes. And I can see, it's interesting when I'm sorry, that you're telling, when you mentioned that there was a 5th character, I do feel like there's a lot of characters in this book, in a good way, not in a bad way. Each one is fascinating. So, having an extra one would be a lot in this space for the reader to toggle, but it sounds like that was destiny, because, we get to hear about her in your next book. Juana was a character who was interesting to me. I know that I'd heard in an interview that she was actually one of your favorite characters in this, and she's the only one that she doesn't live with the four friends in the office tell. She didn't grow up with them. Can you tell us a little bit about Juana and what her place is in the novel?
So I started writing her when I was pregnant, and I think a lot of the anxieties that I had being pregnant and kind of in a dark place also manifested itself. But a lot of Korean women, I had mentioned the low birth rate earlier, but there is so much anxiety surrounding children in Korea because there is such an intense competition academically and in the job world later. So you just can't help worrying a lot, and that kind of collective worrying from people around me made its way into that character. And I love her particularly because she is so damaged from her familial kind of intergenerational trauma, and that too is an all too common story because there has been historically so much burden and expectation placed on male children, and so the daughters-in-law that marry into a family that have a lot of expectation placed on sons experience a lot of this trauma, and that this is more in the previous generations. You don't see any of that, or not any, but less of that now. And I was just thinking of all the different women that I have in my life and what they've been through, and those storylines.
Yeah, and that was so specific to these characters in this world, but it's also such a universal theme. And it's interesting that you say you like backstory. I think you actually did a really good job of weaving it. I like backstory too, but it can become, unbalanced. And I think you wove it in a really balanced way. So it gave the characters a lot of depth, and certainly we know where they came from. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but we know where they came from. We know what some of that intergenerational trauma is in their lives, and how the world has changed so much. How they are, I had such empathy or sympathy for these characters who are trying to make their way in this hyper competitive world of Seoul. And actually there was a passage on, maybe you could read it. It was really heartbreaking and powerful on page 151. And it begins with hundreds, no thousands of apartments. Let me see if that's the beginning of the, it's in the middle of that big paragraph. It's like halfway down, hundreds, no thousands of apartments.
Mm.
And let's see, who's speaking this? I believe this is Ara. This is Ara again, yeah.
Yeah, hundreds, no thousands of apartments, so far away from the heart of the capital, and yet I will never be able to afford a single one, no matter how much I save all my life. In a way, I will be glad when we are almost home, and the scenery will turn into rice fields and farm plots, and I will be reminded of how far I have come instead of what I cannot reach. And I think that's a universal thing too. It's so, certainly in New York, when you see so much real estate, the obsession with real estate, it's very comparable to Korea too, where the real estate obsession, the prices are prohibitive for young people, which impacts the next generation's dreams and realities. But here, I feel like the option is at least you can move out of New York and go to a more affordable state. And it's less so in Korea, where the provinces are increasingly kind of abandoned, and everything revolves around Seoul.
That's
And
a really interesting dichotomy. I mean, I think we do have that in the States in terms of areas where, factory towns that have been decimated, and, many of them, when new businesses don't come in, a lot of them, the only thing keeping them going is low paying minimum wage jobs or tourism. But then you do have a lot of smaller cities like Tampa or Colorado, where young people are going, and places where there is a lot more business. So you don't see that happening at all in South Korea, like it's Seoul kind of. Are there any other major cities or not? It's kind of just the Seoul or the provinces.
Busan, and yeah, there are other cities for sure. Um, I just read this past summer that the rate of increase in real estate prices is the highest in the world in Seoul
That's
specifically.
crazy. I just have to say, because that's like San Francisco before everyone went remote was insane. What you could get. And I guess I looked up Officetel, and I was actually ended down a rabbit hole of a real estate site, and what couples were looking at in terms of the square footage and what was available, and it was really an eye opener because these are tiny spaces.
Yeah, they're really tiny. And I don't know, it's really specific to Seoul, I think. And the government has tried so desperately to curb the rate, and they're rolling out different policies to address it, but it really doesn't work. And every day when I was in Korea, I go back every summer, and it's all about policies and
Hmm.
different laws to try to address this, because it affects society on every level.
Yeah, that's again, it's wonderful to get this contrast, something that's so different, and learn about a different place, and also see the parallels and the universality of some of these issues that really are, you know, part of humanity in a sort of a shrinking globe. We have a question from one of our audience members. Where do you learn to pitch to agents? Any specific books and websites you'd recommend? And how should the query letter be organized? I'm going to just jump in on this. You're welcome to answer this, Francis, but I will just say before you do answer that there is so much information about this on the internet, and examples of query letters, and just Publishers Marketplace is probably the best source in terms of getting a $25 a month membership, and then you can Google every single thing about every agent. But
Yeah.
in your particular case, Francis, how did you approach it?
I was reading obsessively all the publishing blogs like Electric Literature, different authors' interviews where they spoke about how they reached out to their agents. And I tried to go through people I knew with agents, but it's always a little, um, such an awkward thing to ask someone to introduce you. It was very surprising how some people were so generous with their recommendations. So Teresa, I went through a family friend of mine who is also represented by her, and she's also Korean. So again, it was a very Korean story, but she was so generous to introduce me.
Okay, well, that's certainly that's nice to have that. But it sounds like you had offers from other agents that were not necessarily, recommendations. So certainly, people do get agents through querying, and I encourage people to do a lot of Googling on that. And the query letter, I think the query letter is incredibly important. And there are certain formulas for that, which we won't go into here, but that's really accessible online. Go ahead, Francis.
I struggle with, when you're on this. I was talking to a bookstore owner the other day, and she was saying, what is your book about? And I just freeze up. And I can't answer. It's still so hard to try to summarize a book, especially your book, and have an elevator pitch for that. It's just so hard.
Yeah, I think most authors, the synopsis is the most dreaded part of writing. It's the hardest thing. But being able to do that effectively is important. And your book is hard to encapsulate in a snapshot because it's, it does cover really a lot of big topics, socioeconomic hardship, beauty standards, the relationship and between men and women, and and it's about these four friends and each of their arc, and generational trauma and filial piety. I mean, there's a lot. You got a lot going on, but it's all tethered by the lives of these characters, and that's what I found the most compelling. We haven't talked at all about. I don't see any other questions right now, but let's see. Nope. Okay, but if anyone has, here's one. Okay, from Liz Chick, another question on publishing. What for Frances is the hardest part of the book marketing process? That's a great question. And did your agent or editor provide guidance on touring, etc.? Thank you. Good question.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I would say social media is the most harrowing part of an introverted writer. I do see other writers posting very frequently and so wittily and very candidly about their life. Whereas I think my personality, I just get so much anxiety about posting that I just kind of withdraw and end up not posting at all, which is the exact opposite of what you should be doing. The social media part is the hardest part for me, particularly. Touring, it's not really for me. It's more about like my publicist will help set up events like this one, but it's more about interview requests and things like that. They don't necessarily have a tried and true formula for it. It really varies by the book. So for me, it's been a lot about Asian panels and platforms, and people who are interested in the Korean story.
That's interesting to me to hear that, and it's a little discouraging, I'll be honest, because it does create these silos. The book breaks down the silos, but then in the way it's marketed, it kind of reinforces the silos. And I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe I'm off base.
I think the publisher does send out, press releases to everyone they can for every book, but it does, it varies according to the book, like what.
Yeah.
Where.
Yeah, and there's so much competition and they have to find the niche. And we have a couple more questions. And actually one of them, well, someone, this is a little out of order because someone had put one up earlier. I don't want to neglect. What kept you motivated to keep writing the book? And what would you tell yourself during a writing slump?
Oh my gosh, it was so much desperation. I honestly, going to MFA was the biggest motivation for me, because at that, it was such a huge commitment that I went into debt for, and you're putting in so much time and money into this dream, and it's really, for me, like, oh, I must do this or die kind of commitment. And afterwards, it was when I had kind of despair moments about, oh, I'll never be able to publish. I would think, okay, but you really just have to, because otherwise it will have been for nothing. So that kind of desperation really motivated me. Also, having children in a way motivated me, because I was very desperate to get some time away from them. And this was a really great justification for it.
Yeah, for sure.
And justifying to myself, like, why I needed some time out. because that's very hard to do when you're in the mom mentality of feeling so much guilt.
It's really hard, and I mean, certainly I went through that when my kids were young, and I remember actually I also lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn at that time, and I remember at one time, you know, I had a babysitter come into my apartment. That didn't really help me because I couldn't write in the same floor through, and I actually would sometimes sit on the stairwell of my, you know, brownstone, you know, using one step to sit on and another step to write on. You know, it's I have so many stories about the crazy places I've written, so it's hard with kids. So I certainly sympathize with that. We have another question here. Did you have particular authors in mind as you wrote the book? And did you suggest comparable books when you sought an agent? Well, certainly the comps are really important, right? But that must have been hard if there weren't a lot of Korean comps.
And so it was kind of, I'm trying to remember what the first one was, but Crazy Rich Asians had come out, which was a huge success. And that was very surprising to everyone in publishing, I think, that it was a success. And so even though it's not necessarily the best comp, because, you know, it's about different countries entirely, I would say, oh, it's very contemporary. So Crazy Rich Asians meets, I think I said Murakami, because Murakami is also writing about contemporary Japan, and all the characters are Japanese. Of course, it's translated, but it's a contemporary Asian story in Asia, not an Asian American immigration story. So just trying to drive that point home.
That's actually very interesting and helpful. It's very particular. You know, you were specific and intentional about what your comps were, which from everything I've heard, the comps are incredibly important, because it also, you know, we'd like to believe as writers that we do the writing work and then we give it to our agent and the publisher and they do the rest. And that's just not the case anymore. Writers have to do more and more of everything. And even in marketing, you know, we know our book better than anyone. So, you know, giving an idea to when your agent is pitching your book to editors, having an idea of how the editor might market this book is a really important factor, because, you know, one of the things I've learned is that as much as writing for us is our heart and soul, books are a commodity, and it's actually a business, and they have to figure out how to sell these books, and especially with all of the incredible competition for our attention, and TV and movies, and you know, and all the many books out there, you have to know how you're going to sell a particular book. So it's interesting that you came up with a very intentional and precise, you know, comps. Actually, I'm impressed.
Yeah, it was kind of out of necessity because there really weren't any others out of Korea. But I did try to do some, you know, other Asian stories at least.
Well, listen, we're coming to the end, and I want to give you a chance. Is there anything we did not cover? Any story, any strange, weird thing that happened to you? Actually, I have one question. When you know, so the book came out and you had to, you're sort of navigate the world of social media. Ugh, God help you. You know, we're all trying to do that. But you also probably got reviews. Did you get any negative responses? Was there any kind of backlash? Did you have any kind of, you know, because there is that moment where you're suddenly your book is public, and that must have been a little scary.
It is very, very, very scary. The thing about social media is that you are tagged in real time by readers as well. So just reading, I would say there was a huge array of responses, and certainly there were negative ones. And I think I just tried to erase them from my memory. But yeah, it takes a while to adjust and recalibrate, going from you're hiding in the corner just by yourself in the dark writing with despair that no one's ever going to read it, to having it out in the world with all these opinions, pouring in about it, I'm still recovering, honestly.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. And
Yeah, even the positive reviews are positive in a way that kind of sometimes made me uncomfortable, what we've been talking about. So that's it's just like if you're an introvert, it just takes some time to recover. And the best way for me has just been to try to step away, honestly.
that's great advice, because as a writer, you're right. We have to go into our private space, spend a lot of time there. And that's very different from what's required in getting your book out there into the public. So,
yeah, I have to say, just because of this is the Columbia event, I am so grateful to the Fiction Foundry. Again, I was mentioning in the beginning, but it really helped me kind of jumpstart my second start into writing. And then after a while, I felt, because at that time it meant once a month, and I felt so desperate that I needed to produce quickly, and that I had no time. We kind of broke off. A few of us broke off from the Foundry into a weekly workshop, and we met every single week with submissions every week. And that was, I think, the most helpful thing ever. So I highly recommend, if you have someone you really trust in terms of feedback, and someone you don't mind spending an hour a week with.
that's great advice. I think that feedback loop is so incredibly important. And once a week, that's you obviously were very motivated, because that's hard to produce
Hard.
on a weekly basis. But I hear we have to end. I could keep talking to you forever, but I think that's also an indication of the work ethic. That the book doesn't happen on its own, and you have to put the work in and the time in, and obviously you did. And we have this wonderful book to show for it, and another one on its way. So I won't ask you when it's coming out, but because that's too much pressure. But we know it's in the pipeline, and that's exciting. And it's just been so much fun to talk to you, Frances. Thank you for making the time. And Frances told us ahead of time that there was a little bit of construction in her building, and they were very kind and generous. I didn't hear a peep, and my lawn guys didn't start blowing their leaf blowers. So the stars all came into alignment for this. And thank you so much, Frances.
Here, I really appreciate it, everybody, and best of luck in your writing if you are writing.
Thank you. And yes, thank you for our audience. It's sort of awful not to be able to see you. Normally, I actually really like to talk to the audience and bring them in. But thank you to the Columbia Alumni Association and Jenna, who has been, Jenna Farley Fleming, who's been just an incredible, oh, there she is. It's been an amazing help. I am personally deeply grateful. So thank you for everyone. And we'll do this again. In the meantime, enjoy this day.
Bye.
Bye.